all the kids to come up. Anyone who's willing to come up. I know it's asphalt, but if you'd like to come up and gather around up here, you're very welcome to. Just move the microphone back a little here. Come on, right up here. Yeah, have a seat here. If you sit facing me out, and we'll have a little conversation. Here, I'll come down here too. Who in your life is a good neighbor to you? Who's a good neighbor that you have? Gavin?
My neighbor, Mrs. Berry.
Mrs. Berry.
Mm-hmm.
And what does Mrs. Berry do that makes her a good neighbor?
Well,
Anything you can think of that she's done for you, done with you?
she has given me carrots.
Her what?
Carrots.
Giving you cards. That's very kind. Thank you, Gavin. Amalia, you were pointing at someone here.
She's my best friend. Can we go sit next to her?
Yes, you can. Julian, who's a good neighbor to you? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Ben, and Ben has a tractor and he gives you tractor rides? Yes. That's true. Anyone else? Who is a good neighbor to you in your life? Maybe they live right next door to you and maybe they live farther away. One of my cousins was named Nate, and Nate is someone I know who was a good neighbor. Sometimes Nate would be, and he'd even be a good neighbor in ways that people didn't expect at all. One time he was walking down the street and started talking to someone who lived on the street who had no home. And while they were talking, my cousin just took off his coat and gave it to that person because that person who was living outside had no coat. And they said, "Oh, no, no." And he said, "No, it's all right. I got it secondhand." And he just let them have it and said goodbye and walked on his way. And actually, it turns out he did that more than once. He did that a lot. And my cousin Nate, one time, he was at work. He worked at a pub, and there was a person there who got angry and upset and was frustrated. And a lot of other people were trying to kind of push that person out the door, and he wasn't going. And my cousin Nate walked up to that man and put his arms around him and gave him a hug and said, "You are loved." And the man quieted down and chose all by himself to walk out and leave and go somewhere where he could have more peace. So Nate is someone in my life who I have seen be a good neighbor. And Gavin, were you thinking of someone else?
I have someone on my baseball team named Nate.
That's great. Thanks for telling me. I'm glad there are more Nates in the world.
And his brother is Ben.
And his brother is Ben. You know, when my cousin Nate hugged those people, or when he hugged that man and when he gave his coat to those people, there's no rule against doing those things. But sometimes we pretend that those are not things we should do, like give people our coat. Sometimes we pretend those aren't ways that we could be a good neighbor, but we can. And Jesus liked to play with this to help us learn what are the pretend rules about the world and what are the rules of love in the world. In the reading we heard from Jesus today, there's a person, he tells the story of someone who gets hurt on the side of the road and 3 people go by. And which of them was a good neighbor? Do you remember the people who go by? First a priest goes by and says, oh, and walks on the other side of the road. And then a Levite walks by and says, oh, and goes on the other side of the road. And then a third person comes by. Gavin, you have your hand up.
And that's the Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan, yes. And what makes the Samaritan good?
He's a good neighbor.
He's a good neighbor by going over to the person who's hurt, and they didn't have Band-Aids back then, but he used some other things to take care of the man. He put some oil on him and wrapped some cloth around him, and then he picked him up and put him on his donkey, because he didn't have a car either. So he put him on his donkey and brought him somewhere where he could be safe. And that sounds pretty obvious. Like that's a good neighborly thing to do. But what's tricky is that the priest and the Levite who went the other way, they were obeying some pretend rules of the world. The pretend rules said you shouldn't touch people who are sick or who are hurt too bad, because then you won't be clean anymore. But the Samaritan knew that those pretend rules weren't as important as the love rules. And so the Samaritan, just like Jesus wants us to do, did the love rule. And Jesus actually broke all kinds of pretend rules to show us the love rules. There were rules that said you couldn't eat with certain of your neighbors, and Jesus ate with them anyway. And in fact, Jesus would say, I'm coming to your house for dinner. And he'd invite himself over for dinner at those neighbors' houses. There is a pretend rule that said you couldn't talk with people from other lands. And Jesus just went over and talked to them. And Jesus actually learned more about God from those people from other lands. There was even a pretend rule that said you couldn't eat with poor people or folks with certain kinds of jobs. And Jesus would go over and eat with those people and learn about God from them. Jesus did all of those things to show us how to go past the pretend rules to get to the love rules. I think that your good neighbors that you have, if someone made a pretend rule that you couldn't give cards to people, like Mrs. Berry, and if someone made a pretend rule that Ben couldn't share his tractor with you, Julian, if someone made those pretend rules, I bet your neighbors would keep giving you cards and keep giving you tractor rides, because they know that that's the loving thing to do. And they would be just like my cousin Nate, who went right through the pretend rules in order to follow the love rules. And there have been a lot of Christians all through the ages who did this too. Because sometimes people have made up rules that you couldn't marry someone who looked different from you, or boys couldn't marry boys, or girls couldn't marry girls. And there were Christians who walked right through those rules anyway, so that they could follow love. And sometimes there have been rules who said that the state of New Hampshire could take people away and take away their lives. And people in this very congregation helped change those rules so that there's the rule of love. And there's even been places where there were rules and they said, okay, you folks have to have fights. Can you even imagine that? People making up pretend rules that said we have to have a fight here? And people said, some Christians, they stood up and said, nope, that's not love. We're going to be good neighbors, even though someone made up a silly rule. We still have a few pretend rules that we're trying to get past. There are still pretend rules that say that it's okay to hurt the earth. There's still pretend rules that say that it's okay for some people to be very rich while many, many people are poor. We still need to be tricky like Jesus so that we can hug people who need a hug, so that we can give a coat to people who need a coat, so that we can give everyone a card, give everyone a tractor ride. And we can do that. The way that Christians do that is we read the story of the Good Samaritan again. We read the Bible, we listen to Jesus in our hearts, and that's how we know which rule is a love rule. So maybe when we're all grown up, maybe when all of us are all grown up, we will have changed all these rules into love rules, and I know that that will bring a smile to God's face. And I think that when you grow up, that people will, if I ask people, who is a good neighbor to you? I think someday people will say, Gavin is a good neighbor. to me. And I think people will say, Julian is a good neighbor to me. Laurel, you're a good neighbor to me. I think they'll use your name to talk about good neighbors. And I know that that will make God smile too. You're welcome to return to your seats.